Okay, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, this is going to be our first video on the theory of evolution. So I'm going to kind of outline some of the history, a little bit about the theory, and then just kind of the big idea of what the theory is trying to postulate. As you're listening to this video, I highly recommend having out your handy dandy notebooks and making sure that you're supplementing to your notes or adding anything that you feel like is very valuable. Because today we're going to talk about some really big picture stuff about what is evolution and what does it actually state. Um, so let's start with a little bit about the actual theory of evolution. It was proposed by Charles Darwin, but just like um, before when we talked about Watson and Crick and the discovery of the DNA model, it's not that some guy just woke up and had an epiphany and he knew all the answers. It actually came as basically the person who's kind of given credit is the person who put a lot of ideas together and was able to put it all together into some cohesive working theory. Now, again, we're talking about a theory here. And scientific theory is an explanation of what is causing something. Right? And the question, this is the theory of evolution. This is the theory of why organisms change over time, and this explains why this happens or how this happens. Um, we are all familiar with Charles Darwin, the name Charles Darwin, um, but let's talk a little bit about some of the things that worked with him. Charles Darwin, or the idea that species change over time was not new to Charles Darwin. In fact, it had come around easily a century beforehand. That species are going to change over time, starting with a very famous French naturalist, which is just a fancy term for general scientist, Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck. And de Lamarck was very well known and very well respected in his field, and he basically claimed that organisms change over time through acquired traits. Now, this is a lot different than what the current theory of evolution states. Acquired traits means that any skill or activity that you've gained or trait you've gained through your lifetime would be passed down to the next generation. The most classic example of this is the giraffes. Giraffes who maybe are reaching their neck to get that top leaf throughout their entire life are more likely to have kids who have longer necks because they've been acquired that trait through their lifetime. You know, the idea that if my dad is a football player, I'm going to be a really good football player. It's an acquired trait. We know now that that's not quite true. That, after talking about our unit of evolution or genetics, it's all about inherited traits. The traits, the genes, the DNA sequences that we get from our parents are going to determine our traits. Now, with that said, if my father has the traits for higher levels of muscle development and bone growth, I'm going to get that trait. I might be able to be a little bit bigger and stronger as I grow up and make me a little bit better, say in football or something like that. But it is not passed down because of what I do, my kids get to do. All right. So he was the first one to talk about species change through acquired traits, which we now know Darwin talked about inherited traits. That led to Charles Darwin was actually originally, like his father, trained to be a pastor and to be a religious figure. But he really loved to learn, and from a well-off family, he decided to take some time off and kind of explore the world. As an educated man, he ended up hitching a ride on the HMS Beagle. The HMS Beagle was a ship that was going to survey a lot of the coast of South America. And he was going on as the ship's naturalist, basically the scientist. He was going to observe a lot of the species on the islands there. Now, he learned a lot of other things. On a boat, all you can do is really read, and so he's spending a lot of times reading Lamarck's work and other scientists' work, which we'll talk about. But one of the biggest things is that he started journaling, and one of the most popular things that he talked about is what we call at the Galapagos Islands, or what we now call Darwin's finches. So, So let me show this here real quick. So here we have Darwin's finches, a sketch of actually some of the things he drew. And he noticed that the Galapagos Islands is made up of very small islands, very close to each other. And he noticed the species of finch, which is a type of bird. And he noticed that they were very, very similar to each other. And he wasn't really sure why they would be any different from each other when they're so close together. And one thing he realized is that they all had very different food sources. Well, like something like this was more likely to have a big, strong beak to be able to eat very hard nuts and tree nuts. And this one was maybe to eat more fruit, to be able to dive into it, while this long, slender one was maybe one that was their primary diet involved insects. They had to reach into trees, so a longer, skinnier beak was more suitable for that situation. And so what he's starting to realize is like, species change over time. Maybe there's something that is causing that change. And he's seeing it as maybe it has to do something with the food source. So he's logging a lot of the stuff and reading, and some of the people he's reading is a geologist named Charles Lyell. Again, he's a geologist. He's not really trying to just talk about evolution. But he does propose a very dramatic paper in the field of geology, and he just basically says that the world is very, very old. And this goes against a lot of biblical texts, which dates the earth as only several thousand years old. He's saying that probably more like millions, maybe billions of years old, and that any change that's happened on this planet takes an extremely long time. It is a very, very gradual change over a long period of time. More than just a few generations, more than just a couple hundred years, a couple thousand years. We're talking millions of years to see substantial changes in the earth. When Darwin returns to England, he's got this idea of, okay, changes. Maybe there's some sort of pressure that causes changes, maybe food source. He starts talking to professional breeders about, do these changes take over a long period of time? And breeders introduce him to this idea of artificial selection. The idea, especially they did it with pigeons, carrier pigeons. You pick the biggest and strongest pigeons to pass down their traits to their offspring. And that they did that so much that the only type of carrier pigeon available was very very large, and the one known for 100 years before, the smaller wiry chicken or pigeon was not available because of all the changes. And this leads to to an economist named Malthus. Malthus was an economist who published a very influential paper that really, one thing that Charles Darwin pulled out of that was this idea. He talked about resources. And he said that basically resources are limited in the world, and those who are the most adequate to acquire those resources are likely to keep those resources and thrive. Now, he was an economist, so he was talking about money and land. Those who were the smartest, who had the best financial start, were more likely to be able to acquire more finances and more land, and thus be more powerful and do better off. But Darwin took this idea as like, okay, let's think about food. Let's think about maybe the reason why they're changing is because the finite resources is food, or the finite resources is mating. So adding this idea of what eventually most people will call survival of the fittest, although there's issues with that terminology, but this idea of those who are well adapted to their environment are more likely going to do well and pass down that wealth, or in this case, genetics. And it finally came to Alfred Wallace, who was actually a really good friend of Charles Darwin, and they wrote letters back and forth a lot to each other. And Alfred Wallace pitched him this idea that Wallace called natural selection. And Darwin was a big fan of this idea and incorporated it along with all these other ideas. We're going to talk more about what natural selection is going forward, but natural selection, shorthand, is basically saying that an organism that is most suited to the environment to gain resources is more likely to survive and pass down those resources or those traits. The giraffe that has the longer neck is going to be able to reach the higher trees and thus more likely to get more food, more likely to be able to survive and pass down that trait of long neck to their offspring. That is natural selection. Darwin kind of took that, incorporated it into everything else that he had, and developed and published his first works in 1859 on in a book called On the Origin of Species. It is a very pivotal book in the history of science and modern science. I will say personally, I did have to read it in college. It is a very dry subject. It is a very dry book, but it does highlight this theory of evolution by natural selection. Evolution. Now let's talk a little bit about what evolution is, all right, and what he proposed in it. He says that evolution is a change in the alleles or the change in traits. Remember, alleles, those are the different versions of traits: long neck, short neck, brown hair, non-brown hair. All right, changes in alleles within a population over a long period of time. Borrowing Lyell's idea. All right, and these changes caused by natural selection, where some traits are more favorable in an environment than others. That's going to determine what direction the change of environment happens. All right, and there's all kinds of examples. I could do the giraffe example, but one that was actually very popular that happened in the 19th century was one that was actually evolution caused by humans. If we wouldn't have intervened, it wouldn't have been a little bit different. But just to kind of give a quick overview of what this theory states, I'm going to use this here. It is the story of what we call the pepper moth. Right? So I have a little gizmo here to kind of help me with it. So the idea is a change in population over time. So now the question is, let's make that nice and big. All right, a change in population over time caused by natural selection. So right here, what we're going to do here, you can see right here, this background here, this is actually of a tree, of a I think they were birch trees. Yeah, they were birch trees found in England, very common in England, and they have this white texture. And there was the peppered moth, which basically had two alleles. It had a light color and it had a dark color, right? So there were two versions of this. There was the dark color moth and the light color moth. And one of the major predator of the peppered moth was just birds, a lot of different kinds of birds. And so what would happen is over time, if we started, say, with the 50-50 percentage of the population, all right, half of them are dark, half of them are light, all right, birds would come in and they would be able to eat any of the dark colored peppered moths. I didn't think there was any. All right. Now the white ones are on there, but they're blended in, so you can't really see them very well. And so they had nice camouflage. They had a trait that was beneficial to them. So as we keep going, right, from year to year, the dark ones had nothing that they were doing. They weren't changing. The white ones weren't changing to become this. They were just had a trait that was beneficial to them. This is natural selection, which means they were less likely to be eaten, which means they were more likely to pass down the white trait down. So now we have a change in the population. So this was only over 2 years, but this happened over several years. We had a change in the population, where the vast majority of the population is now light colored. Right? So we had a change in the population. This is what we call microevolution, just a small change within a population, small version population. All right. So, we can see on the graph here that we have one population, one allele increasing, one decreasing. So if we keep going, right, that we're going to see a bigger change in the overall population over time. Oops. Unless I keep clicking. So we can see still a change in the population over time. So this is what we would call, again, microevolution, but evolution. Nature is given a benefit to one or the other. Now, what happened in this situation here in England around the Industrial Revolution is a lot of factories were going up, a lot of pollution was put into the air, and a lot of the birch trees around the area became covered in soot. And what it did is it changed the color of a lot of those trees, and they became a darker color. Now, as you could probably guess what this means is that the population started to change because all of a sudden there was no mutation. The dark ones didn't change. They still exist, but now the white ones have an unfavorable trait. This is natural selection. Those who have a favorable trait are more likely to survive. Those with an unfavorable trait are less likely to survive. So now we start to have a shift in the population once again. This is evolution occurring. Evolution is a change in the alleles in a population. So the number of light alleles is going down, which means more food, more opportunities for the dark ones to reproduce and thus become more populated and become more common, right? So now we can see that there's a change in the population there. So now we've shifted the population back. We have a change. See how it's changed? Was nearly almost 50-50. Now it's 70-30. We have evolution occurring. Evolution and that change in the population over time. All right. Sometimes it's caused by man-made effects. Sometimes it's a mutation. Most mutations don't do anything. Most mutations don't, lead to anything. But if there is a mutation that gives you an advantage, camouflage, all right, a little bit stronger, all right, maybe a little bit faster to avoid predators, maybe a little bit better at grabbing food, or even just one as simple as like you develop a mutation where an enzyme now digests food more efficiently. It means you can eat more food, which means you're more likely to survive, which means you're more likely to pass down that weird trait, where the weird trait now becomes the normal, and that is evolution. All right, and it's not always about survival. All right, it's again the main mechanism of evolution and natural selection is about reproduction. So a classic example of that is with birds. All right, and the ability to reproduce. We know that birds do a lot of mating calls and things like that. And whatever organisms can do to acquire or to basically gain a mate to pass down that trait, then evolution is going to occur. They don't have to be the biggest. They don't have to be the strongest. They have to be able to reproduce. So a lot of birds have created what we call sexual selection, where they've created traits and sometimes terrifying traits that allow them to gather or to basically acquire a mate and pass down those traits. If this guy is able to get a mate because of his weird display, then that weird display is going to be passed down to his children. We see this a lot of times with peacocks is the same way. It's not the females that are beautifully designed. It's, with all the colors, it's the males because they're trying to acquire a mate. And if they're able to pass down that trait, then their kids are going to have those colorful traits as well. So, in conclusion, Darwin had lots of different things that influenced him, a lot of different ideas. But in the end, we had come with this idea of the theory of evolution. A change in a population's alleles over a very long period of time. And it takes a very long time, this typically to happen. The pepper moth example was something that happens pretty quickly. But it was because we evolved into it, or were involved into it. Unless there's some sort of dramatic effect, huge climate shift or something like that, this process normally takes thousands of generations to make this actual change. All right. So next time I'll talk a little bit more about natural selection, the different types of natural selection. This was just kind of an introduction to a lot of different stuff. Make sure you go over this video if you didn't get a chance to, add anything you need to, especially about what is evolution, what is natural selection, and a lot of Darwin's influences. But otherwise, thanks for listening and good luck, and may the science be with you.